Hello, welcome back to the second part of this lecture. And what we're going to be doing now is to have a look at which factors determine whether or not people are kind. And the literature kind of pulls out a whole range of different factors, things such as whether it's in their interests to be kind. So does kindness serve them in some way? And these kind of arguments are usually taken up by evolutionary theorists. If they've learned that kindness pays off, the idea of kindness as learnt behaviour that's been rewarded, or where you've seen other people behaving in those ways. If the situation appears to require it, so there's loads of research into situational factors that increase or decrease the likelihood of kind behaviour. If they come from a culture which encourages kindness, so there's huge cultural and subcultural differences in kind behaviour or frequency of kind behaviour. If they feel able and willing to help, this is key, and I'll explain why in a bit. And if they think the person deserves it, again, key. This is really the crux of the matter. We don't help everyone who needs it. We're not kind to everybody. And a lot of that is related to constructions of deserving and undeserving. And so we're going to be looking at all of these in more detail. So the first thing is around if it's in their interests to be kind. And much of the debate on this has, I think, been hijacked by evolutionary psychologists and sociobiologists and the literature on altruism. Now, altruism, on the face of it, presents problems for evolutionary theory. You know, that it's not in your interest to do stuff at cost to yourself, that it makes much more sense for selfishness to have been selected for. But developments in Darwinian theory change the unit of survival and reproduction from the individual to the gene. And all of this really kind of took off with the publication of a book called The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins back in 1976. And what Dawkins was saying was that people are basically survival machines to help propagate more genes. So really the unit of reproduction is the gene, not the individual. It's not about survival of the individual, it's about survival of the gene. Okay? So then you get the idea that of inclusive fitness. And inclusive fitness then is basically all about the likelihood that your genes will survive in the gene pool. That's the game that we're really kind of in. And that's what Hamilton was talking about back in 1964. But it was only really when Richard Dawkins published The Selfish Gene that then there was the idea really kind of took off, right? And from there you get the idea that that then we have kin selection, where it makes sense then for us to make sacrifices for those who we're genetically related to. And so the closer the relationship, the more you're likely to sacrifice. So I've got this quote here from Haldane, who's one of my heroes, by the way. I'll explain why I adore them in a minute. But Haldane, this famous quote here: "I shall lay down my life for 2 brothers or 8 cousins." So the idea being that siblings are have 4 times as many shared genes than they would do with their cousins. Okay, so it's a straightforward kind of mathematical equation of sacrifice. Let me tell you briefly about Haldane, why I just think he's hilarious. That basically he emigrated to India and on arriving said 60 years in socks is enough. Anyway, so we've got kin selection, we've got inclusive fitness, and then we've got another way of kind of making sense of kindness from an evolutionary or sociobiological perspective is reciprocal altruism. And it's really this idea that this kind of you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours kind of approach. And reciprocal altruism makes sense in evolutionary terms. You know, people living in caves wouldn't have survived for long in isolation. That it, you know, it makes sense for there to be genetic tendencies towards cooperation and sociability, and therefore makes sense that reciprocal altruism would prevail. Now, this is all very kind of interesting stuff, perhaps, but one of the issues with it is, or one of the questions raised is really whether or not it accounts for the myriad forms of human kindness that prevail. You know, so if you think about things like adoption, for instance, you're not perpetuating your genes in the gene pool, but it's an extraordinary act of kindness, which of course has great benefit to the person carrying it out, but at enormous cost. It also doesn't explain things like, you know, why people run into burning buildings to save strangers, for instance. So, you know, this is really the question that you need to kind of ask yourself. The other thing, of course, is that there are other forms of self-interest. You know, that these can come into play when we look at kindness. So, for instance, when we look at motivations for voluntary work, that it can be, sorry, the slide's gone all wonky, hasn't it? Oh, I do apologise. That motivations for voluntary work can be things like wanting to help other people, but also wanting to meet new people, wanting to get training, wanting something to put on your CV, wanting a way into an organisation, get your foot in the door, hopefully you'll get a job. And what they found was that people volunteer for longer if both these kind of self and other directed motivations are addressed. So, you know, having kind of self-interest isn't necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't necessarily work against altruism. The next thing is that people might act kindly if they learn that kindness pays off. So we know that kindness is learnt behaviour, and that people will, it works even if we tell people to be kind. You know, if people are, even if people are kind only by instruction, that can work, although not if in fact the person instructing you to be kind is blatantly being unkind themselves. You know, if they're kind of shouting gruffly at you to be kind, then it might not kind of work that well. But instruction does generally work. Reinforcement works, so if you're kind of rewarded for the good behaviour, and also exposure to models. So we know in fact that modelling is actually more effective in rewarding kindness than reinforcement. So all of this comes from Bandura's social learning theory, which I think you've probably almost certainly come across already, so I'm not going to go into it in any detail, but we know that we learn through observing other people and seeing from their behaviour what gets rewarded and what gets punished, and that then kind of guides our own behaviour. And there's been lots of stuff around the idea of kindness in children and how we can encourage kind behaviour in children. And one of the things that comes through is the idea that kind behaviour in children needs to be rewarded, but not too much. So kindness, young children at school will learn social norms of behaviour, and will still be rewarded though initially, still be motivated by reward and punishment. And it's only as they get older and into kind of adolescence that they internalise these social norms and experience personal gratification as a reward of itself. You know, in other words, that they feel better about themselves. And those processes are really, really powerful. And so by kind of giving too much external reward, we actually undermine those powerful internal motivators. And you get into a situation where people will only do something kind if they think they'll get some sort of treat for it, you know, some sort of external reward for it. So that then serves to undermine the kindness. That picture I've got there is of a gorilla called Binti, and you might be able to see there that she's cradling a young child, and it refers to a very famous incident where a 3-year-old boy fell into the gorilla enclosure at a zoo, and it was all obviously horrendous, and as you can see, the child was knocked out and was in grave danger. Other gorillas were kind of circling around, ready to get at the boy, and what Binti did was basically grab the child and cradled him and moved him away from the other gorillas and kept him safe until staff arrived. Now, people had a field day trying to explain this behaviour, and there were all sorts of kind of evolutionary type theories that were drawn upon to explain Binti's behaviour. But actually, what probably happened can be explained if we learn a little bit more about Binti, and that actually when Binti was a baby gorilla, she'd been rejected by her mum, and so when Binti herself became pregnant, the handlers were concerned that she would in turn reject her own baby. I'm not sure what baby gorillas are called. So they gave her training, they gave her parenting training, and rewarded her for being kind to a doll, which meant that in turn, when she then had her baby, she didn't reject it. And it might be that behaviour that we're then seeing kind of acted out when it comes to how she dealt with the unconscious 3-year-old that landed in her enclosure. Anyway, good old Binti. So, next slide. So the next slide is concerned with situational factors. The idea that kindness is more likely if the situation appears to require kindness. And a whole range of situational factors come into play when we look at when people are kind. So one of the factors is whether or not the situation requiring kindness is noticeable, whether it's got our attention. And I think, this is a very kind of 21st century issue now. People rushing around with their headphones on, hoodies up, that they might just not notice what's going on. This Darley and Batson 1973 study always kind of makes me chuckle. They set up a situation where they're on a campus where trainee priests were studying, and they set up this situation where people were rushing to give a talk on the Good Samaritan, no less. They set it up so that while they were on their way to give this talk, there would be somebody that clearly needed help, and they checked to see. The idea was that they were studying to see who actually did stop and help that person. Given that these are people studying to be priests, and given that the talk that they were going to give was on the Good Samaritan. But anyway, what they found was that the key factor in whether or not they did stop and help this person that seemed to be in trouble was if they were told that they needed to hurry up, that they were in a rush to go and give this speech, and if they were, then they rushed on. They weren't able to. They were less likely to stop. So anyway, it just always kind of tickles me. The next and rather depressing factor is whether or not the recipient is considered to be attractive. And this is something which appears to hold sway in a whole kind of range of ways. So there's all sorts of very depressing studies where they looked at who was more likely to stop and help a stranded motorist, or where they left kind of purses and wallets and stuff lying around with pictures of the owner of the wallet in them. And again, they were more likely to be returned if the photo was of someone attractive. So, if they put like a kind of bus pass or driver license or whatever, with an attractive looking person, then less attractive. There's also stuff that kind of plays out. If you're going to be bleeding, try and make sure it's not too gruesome, that it's more appealing looking bloodshed rather than gruesome looking bloodshed. All these kind of things, all rather depressing. Doesn't say very good things about human beings. There's also stuff around how clear or ambivalent the situation is. So the study I cite there by Shotland and Straw, it's a classic old study. They staged a fight between a man and a woman, and they found that people were 3 times as likely to intervene if the woman shouted, "Get away from me, I don't know you," than if she shouted, "Get away from me, I don't know why I married you." And it really kind of shows the kind of narratives that we have around partner violence that again are really rather depressing, but that if we think that there's a close association between a victim and perpetrator, we're less likely to intervene than if we can see that there isn't. There's also stuff around, there was something else I was going to say actually. I think, yeah, there was something around James Bulger, but anyway, I might come back to that later. There's also stuff around there being few bystanders. You're probably all familiar with the Kitty Genevieve literature by Dali and Latan, very, very famous stuff. Really, oh, that's what I was going to say. Please excuse me. 61 people saw James Bulger being taken away from the shopping mall by the 2 children, and he was people, many of whom saw James Bulger crying and distressed, and they didn't do anything because they assumed the 2 boys were his brothers. So this idea of there being a kind of if people believe there's a close connection between victims and perpetrators, they're far less likely to do something. It's seen as a much more kind of ambivalent situation that's not appropriate for them to intervene on than if it's clear. The bystanders thing, like I say, the Kitty Genevieve, if you're not familiar with the case, do look it up. It might feel kind of like common sense that the more people that see something bad going on, the more people there are, the more likely it is that someone will respond. But actually, the research suggests the opposite, that if there are lots of bystanders, it's less likely that anyone will intervene. And in fact, if you're ever in that situation yourself where you need help, and there's loads of people around and people aren't helping, the best thing that you can do is single somebody out and ask that person specifically, because if you don't, then there's a danger that no one will take responsibility. So call to people individually rather than generally calling for help, if you see what I mean. There's also stuff around whether or not people consider this to be a special case rather than one of many. If it's one of many, again, they're far less likely to intervene, and whether they see it as a temporary need or an ongoing thing. And this is something that charities really struggle with. People get donor fatigue, and so there's this constant attempt to try and let people know that this is still a problem, that they still need to intervene, that it's still something that they can make a real difference by giving. And it's, like I say, it's a real problem when you've got kind of ongoing problems. The images I've got here are of this heartbreaking case of this little girl, Wang Yue, 2 years old, who wandered into the road and she got knocked over. And you can see there, God bless her, her body lying in the road. And what they found was that 18 people walked past her. Drivers drove past her. One driver even ran over her. And it was absolutely ages before anybody pulled her out of the road. You can see someone walking past her there. And it didn't end well. So let me give you another kind of scenario. So we've got, if you imagine an incident breaking out in a pub, okay? The question I want to ask you is, are people more likely to intervene if it's a mutual fight between 2 drunken men, or if it's a man being abusive and aggressive towards a woman. Now, Parks et al. In 2013 sent researchers out, or supposed researchers out, to 503 nights in 87 pubs and clubs in Toronto. What an awful job. Anyway, so they over 503 nights, people visited 87 pubs and clubs in Toronto. They came across 860 aggressive incidents, and they rated these in terms of levels of aggression, and also made a note of who was involved, whether or not somebody intervened, and if so, who it was, etc., etc. And what they found was, despite the fact that the majority of incidents were option B, a man being abusive and aggressive to a woman, how lovely, people were actually most likely to intervene if it was option A, if it was a mutual fight between two drunken men. Now, that's an interesting one, is it not? Parks et al. Explained this in terms of self-interest, that they thought that, that people said that things are more likely to escalate if it's two drunken men fighting each other, and so it's valuable for them to kind of step in. So it's a self-interested thing for them to step in. Of course, there's other framings and ways of explaining what happened to do with, of course, narratives of gender and gender relationships, and also maybe relates back to that thing of if people think that there's an intimate connection between people, becomes more ambivalent and they're less likely to intervene. Either way, it's all very depressing stuff. The next thing is whether they come from a culture which encourages kindness. And there's lots of stuff around the role of kind of social norms and cultural values. And there's this thing called simpatia. We have no equivalent of this in English, but simpatia is a Spanish word meaning friendly, polite and kind. And Levine in 2005, they staged incidents in 25 different cities around the world. None of them were in the UK, by the way. And they found that Hispanic cities were far more likely, people in Hispanic cities were more likely to help than in others. And in fact, the top three, though, were Rio in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, San Jose in Costa Rica, and Ilongwe in Malawi, whereas the bottom three were Singapore, New York, and Kuala Lumpur. Interesting. So it's also very heavily mediated by in-group and out-group factors, and that's the idea that you're more likely to help someone in your in-group, and especially in collectivist cultures, and maybe that's because there's a stronger sense of in-group. And it suggests, therefore, that we need to kind of teach things like sort of moral inclusion, you know, the idea that we're all one big in-group, we're all human, we all bleed, we all hurt, we all want the same things, that kind of thing. And there's also stuff around reciprocity norms. So the idea that kind of one good turn deserves another, which appears to be universal. It can also be indirect, you know, this idea that the universe has rewarded you rather than any kind of direct reward from individuals. And the other thing that we know is that it plays out very differently according to gender. So with gender, we only kind of reward or give more reward to short-term heroic acts of kindness, whereas kind of longer-term, day in, day out acts of kindness rarely get recognised or rewarded and are far more likely to be carried out by women. So there I'm showing images of, on the bottom there, of a woman caring for an elderly relative. And these kind of things are far more less likely to be recognised or rewarded as acts of kindness than incredible heroic acts, which is not to negate the heroic act, but just to say that they're treated very differently. The image I've got there, by the way, is of Lance Corporal Matthew Croucher, who threw himself on top of a grenade to protect other people. Amazingly, he survived with barely a scratch. He got the St George's Cross. Got the St George's Cross back in 2008 for his efforts. So amazing stuff, but it's just this idea that there are heroic acts of kindness going on every day that don't get rewarded and that tend to be carried out more often by women. The next thing that plays a part in whether or not people are kind is if they feel able and willing to help. And here we're often talking about empathy, which is the psychological identification with or vicarious experiencing of the feelings, thoughts and attitudes of another. And Batson suggests that this is the key to stimulating a kind response. So Batson places empathy at the heart of kindness, that will help others at cost to ourselves when we imagine how they must be feeling. If we can't do that, if we don't feel empathy, then our kindness, if we do carry it out, is due to some other kind of payoff to ourselves. So it's very, very key for Batson. Empathy is key to kindness. But there's also other factors as well, and one of them is self-efficacy. So it's this belief that you have the ability to help, that you feel that there's something that you can do, that you are able to kind of offer something, rather than kind of feeling helpless in the face of other people's need. And there's ways in which we can kind of improve the chances of that through things like kind of first aid training, or other forms of training that enable us to feel more confident of knowing what it is we have to do in any given situation. And it also kind of is impacted on things like if we look around and we see somebody else in uniform, that we might feel more able to then go and ask them to help, the idea being that uniform is a mark of self-efficacy. Now, I'm kind of saying this very aware of the discussions going on around the murder of Sarah Everard allegedly by a serving police officer. But anyway, generally the idea being that people in uniform, the uniform is some kind of mark of self-efficacy. And then there's also stuff around self-attribution. If you see yourself as a kind person, you're more likely to act kindly. Grusek and Medler carried out a very cute study where young children who were told that they were helpful people donated more of their marbles to a needy child than those who were reinforced with verbal praise. So if you believe that you're helpful, if you're told that you're helpful, that's a more important form of motivation for kindness than receiving praise. So very important stuff. And this effect persists over time. It just becomes part of kind of who you are, how you see yourself, a core part of you. Now, the next issue is whether or not we feel the person is deserving of kindness. And this really is key. So you may remember a few years back now, having kind of largely ignored the issue of refugees drowning in the Mediterranean. This poor little body of Anan Kurdi was washed up, 3-year-old Syrian refugee. We'd paid very little attention to the plight of Syrian refugees up till then. But this kind of brought it home, and it led to this huge outpouring of kindness and compassion towards refugees, particularly in Germany. But a few years later, the tide massively turned after one New Year's Eve, when there were angry headlines suggesting that gangs of refugee men had been raping women who were out and about on New Year's Eve. And this had an enormous effect in terms of kind of turning the tide of sympathy against refugees. Of course not amongst everyone, of course not, but it still was hugely impactful, and doors started slamming shut all over the world. It turned out the whole thing was actually lies, and it was all fabricated to change the narrative of refugees and inclusion, and nevertheless it was highly effective. So all these ideas about deserving and undeserving is key. And so some of that is around kind of causal attributions, that we're less likely to help people if we hold them responsible for the situation. So, for instance, if there's someone homeless and we think they're homeless because of their alcoholism rather than because their home was flooded, we tend to make judgments around the deservingness of help, even though obviously alcoholism isn't necessarily something they could help themselves. But there we go. It's about the kind of the narratives of kind of blame and attribution that we have. And some of this we talked about in SS430, didn't we, when we looked at the just belief in the just world hypothesis, and this idea that people get what they deserve, that if something awful happens, the chances are they must have brought it upon themselves in some way. Very, very powerful narratives, and again, in the current situation, which I know is very upsetting, so I'm not going to go into, but the current situation with Sarah Everard walking home in the evening, and it's kind of opened up narratives around women being in public spaces after dark. There's also stuff around in-group, the idea that people that are part of your in-group are more deserving of kindness. So Levine did this really cool study where they found that football fans were more likely to help a struggling jogger, someone that had kind of, you know, twisted their ankle or whatever. They were more likely to help that jogger if the jogger was wearing their own team's football shirt rather than their opposing team. But they found that this was easily changed by just getting the fans to think of themselves as part of the great kind of footballing family. If they were just kind of indicated that they were into football as a whole rather than a specific team, then that they were far more likely to stop and help this jogger in trouble. So they were told that the study was to find out what fans love about football rather than would you help somebody that was wearing this particular football shirt. And then the final thing is whether or not they're similar to you. So all things being equal, we're more likely to help people that are more similar to us in some way. Now, whether that's because it kind of triggers empathy or whether they're kind of easier to identify with, whatever it might be, it appears to be the case. So, to conclude then, what we find is that kindness is mediated by a whole range of factors, including self-interest, genetic and behavioural, situational factors, cultural factors, self-efficacy, and beliefs about deservedness. But the most important thing for us is that kindness is highly correlated with well-being, and that holds whoever the kindness is directed towards, whether it's loved ones, strangers, or yourself. So as the saying goes that we've seen time and time again over the last year, be kind. It's a win-win situation. Benefits you as well as the recipient. So be kind.